I don't know whether we are learning, from the fires. I think we feel that it was a massive aberration and a great catastrophe, and everything will go back to business as usual. I worry actually about whether we're learning the real deep lessons of the fires, or whether we're just seeing it as an unfortunate one-off event. I don't think it is. I think this is the way that Australia will behave more and more in the future, and that we're going to have to adopt different attitudes. Certainly fleeing, which is generally seen as a weakness or something, you don't care enough for your property, so you get out. That's got to change. It's got to be seen as a survival mechanism rather than as a form of weakness. The people in the cities, I've never lived in an urban. I've always lived out in the countryside or on the urban fringe, and where there's a great deal of respect for the elements. People in the cities seem to think that they're immune to these massive problems, and partly the reason they're in the cities is maybe they're afraid of the land and of the power of the land. Patrick White, the novelist, used to say that most Australians huddle in cities. I think it's, over 90% of the Australian population live in these massive cities. And it's partly because we are afraid of the land, and we are worried about whether, the land is so unfamiliar to many of us. Are we able to cope with it? Are we able to understand its moods? Many people think no, and so they head for the cities. Suffering is very important, to take the right attitude towards suffering, to adapt to the elements that in Australia are rather wild, unpredictable, unruly, and at times catastrophic, requires an acceptance of suffering. And that's not something that our egos like. Our egos like to triumph over suffering. I mean, a lot of us go to great lengths to protect ourselves from suffering. And in Australia, that often means protecting ourselves from the elements that cause so much suffering. But certainly, in terms of the future, we are going to find that the moods of Mother Nature are going to get more and more, I think, furious, unpredictable. This is just the nature of the way the physical world is operating now. Partly it's our fault. We have stuffed things up to such an extent that the natural balancing mechanisms in the ecological system have been thrown out of sync, out of balance. And we will have to really accept a whole lot of responsibility for that. Now, we can't just get crippled with guilt and think that, we've messed things up. We have to repair damage, or at least develop different attitudes to live with the more wild and unruly natural elements that is clearly, the future of Australia.
So you're talking about a level of change in behaviour. Do you think we've got the scope or capacity to deal with that change, with those changes? And to what degree do you think people can change?
Well, I think the biggest change that has to happen is to try and develop a spiritual relationship with the land. We're not terribly good at that. We are a bit scared even at the concept of this. There are certain people on the fringes of all our cities, and they're on the fringes partly because they want to relate to the elements. They want to relate to the earth and to the wind and to the seasons and to fire. What they're gaining on the fringes has to be incorporated by the mainstream of Australia. This excuse me, this knowledge that is developing in sort of alternative lifestyle Australia has to be made mainstream. But also it has to learn from Aboriginal knowledge as well. That's very hard to do in cities like Melbourne. I grew up in Alice Springs, which is predominantly, a black town. In Melbourne, you hardly see Aboriginal faces anywhere, and it's partly because my ancestors killed them off and destroyed them early on. So it's very hard for us often in big cities like Melbourne to actually access Aboriginal wisdom. But Aboriginal wisdom, if we had the patience and the compassion and the foresight to actually ask them for their wisdom, would tell us that this landscape loves to burn, and that we'd better build houses, live our lives in the awareness that this burning, this fireballing, is going to happen on a fairly regular basis.